Normally, I begin all of these videos with a greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer lore. Today, however, I think strap in is more fitting, because this is going to be a weird one. And inspired by this piece of artwork, Warhammer The Old World is beginning to look decidedly more like the new world rather than the old. The West Coast in particular, as Warhammer has fallen prey to a rather common affliction these days, transforming all of the fantasy settings into California. And so, out of sheer, pure, and simple spite, I have today decided, at great personal risk as well, mind you, to introduce you to the only canonical black-skinned race in the Warhammer fantasy world created by Games Workshop. I give to you the Pygmies. Oh boy. Whew. That's worse than I remembered. I feel I need to add some context to this before proceeding onwards. The Pygmies were added during the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy way back in 1984, where they came as a part of a supplementary book called The Battle Bestiary. Now, it is worth mentioning that what we know today as Warhammer Fantasy Battles didn't really start fully forming as a coherent world and universe until the third and fourth editions of Warhammer Fantasy, and eventually becoming the world we know today around the fifth edition. One could therefore make a very persuasive argument that this early period of Warhammer was in essence fantasy's very own rogue trader, and therefore anything and everything mentioned during that period is suspect. The Pygmies very much so amongst the list of suspect things mentioned. They were mentioned also offhandedly a few more times through the late 80s. Though their last truly big appearance came in 1988 with the 100th issue of White Dwarf, featuring a peculiar scenario called The Floating Gardens of Bab Elorn, where the player takes on the role of a pygmy warband exploring an ancient ruin that turns out to be a spaceship. Now, after the ruins of Babylon, there have not been a whole lot, if damn near any, direct mentions of the Pygmies, although references to them have been dropped in later editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle as well. Furthermore, the Pygmies have never actually been decanonized out of Games Workshop's lore, and their stat lines, whilst outdated definitely by modern-day Warhammer Fantasy Battles rule sets, could still fairly easily be adopted to modern-day Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and even easier to Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. So, technically speaking, the Pygmies are still Warhammer canon, which is quite the achievement I half expected GW to have in the years since last I encountered these peculiar little creatures, to at least have written a line or two about how the Lizardmen finally finished eating them all or something, to just get them out of the way like they did with the squats, but no, the Pygmies are still there, technically. Although, I imagine you would be getting some interesting stares if you showed up at Warhammer World with a pygmy army. As, this was controversial already back in 1988. But enough spinning around the porridge. I should hopefully have gone beyond the scanning range of the YouTube bot by now. So let's talk about the Pygmies, why they were created, as I feel that's a question that needs answering. And of course, their lore, their habitat, and the fact that they come from space. Yeah. Anyways, let's begin with the why. Because again, I really do feel that deserves some addressing here. Back in the 80s, things were very different than today, as I'm sure you've already gathered. And, I mean, I'll just come out and say it, and it's me saying it, so you know it's serious. The Pygmies were a very racist stereotype, based in all due likelihood on the Pygmy people of Africa. Now, the Pygmies are actually a real thing. They are a specific group of people in Africa that are of remarkably short average stature. This in turn resulted in that when European scientists and explorers discovered the Pygmies in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they assumed they were monkeys. Yeah, not even kidding. There are examples of Pygmies having been brought to the West and placed in zoos. Jesus. You live and you learn. This was then yet further exacerbated by, again, the racist stereotypes of the time into the big-lipped, diminutive, exaggerated proportions of the Pygmies in Warhammer Fantasy. Not, mind you, an altogether uncommon representation of Africans back in the 40s and 60s, but by the time of the late 80s, this would have raised some eyebrows. And having then addressed the why the hell does this exist, let's get to the actual what it is. So, the Pygmies came from space. Again, I am very much so serious here. The Pygmies are the descendants of a spacefaring people that came to the old world, presumably at some point either before or alongside the old ones. Unfortunately, however, they did not possess the landing abilities of the old ones, and so their ancient spaceship struck the planet at an unfortunate velocity. The crew survived, but the vessel itself was beyond any and all repairs. Deprived, therefore, of any hope to ever return to the stars, the Pygmies had to adapt to life in the old world. This wouldn't have been too bad had they landed in the Empire or Cathay or anywhere in between, really, but unfortunately for the Pygmies, their spaceship crash-landed in Lustria. Jesus. They really could not catch a break, it seemed. Understandably upset at being, presumably stranded forever, in the middle of a fetid jungle, the Pygmies soon began an ancient and time-honored human tradition, assigning blame. As no one appeared to be willing to take up the highly honorable mantle of sacrificial sheep, however, this quickly led to some internal conflict, where various parties that divided blame differently began trading blows, and then eventually weapons fire with one another. The resulting outcome of this was that the victorious faction ate the losing faction. Yes, the Pygmies are also cannibals, which is not based on anything in real life, mind you, but oh well. Don't worry though, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation to why the Pygmies decided to eat one another. You see, as a spacefaring civilization, they apparently developed a habit of recycling their own dead. And so, eating them apparently just seemed like a logical continuation. Incidentally, the Pygmies also view the other various human species of the Warhammer world as kin to themselves, e.g., more humans. Obviously, these other humans are weird and pale and strangely tall and disgusting looking. Obviously, some sort of local chaos mutation, no doubt, but close enough to the source material for nom-noms. As there is also a short story where the Pygmies defeat a Norscan raider warband and then eat all of them. Actually, no, that's not entirely true. They eat all of them except for Juan, whom they invite along as an honored guest and feed him his friends. Oh boy. To continue the stereotype, to regulate and control society, of course, the Pygmies are a primarily theocratic society, where the witch doctors hold a tremendous amount of sway over the village. There are chieftains that do the day-to-day running of a village, but they will never act without seeking the permissions and the advice of the witch doctors. Plural, incidentally. As you see, the Pygmies believe that once upon a time the world was created by 13 short kings. I fuck ye not. But today, there are only 2 remaining gods, Brobat and Beesbok. Why? Because they ate the other 11, that's why. Presumably, this has something to do with the original population of the Pygmies when they first arrived in the old world. Perhaps there were once 13 tribes, but at the end of the day, only 2 survived. Regardless of the true origins of this myth, the 2 gods that now remain are Brobat and Beesbok. Out of the 2, Brobat is the most warlike one, the effective god of war and labor. He is smart, he always looks out for himself first, and he never allows silly things such as morals or ethics to get in the way of making sure that he has whatever he needs first. His counterpart, Beesbok, however, is the god of feasts, of fornication, laziness, and general plenty. A proper Pygmy village will have 2 witch doctors, one dedicated to Brobat and one dedicated to Beesbok, because both aspects are necessary. On the one hand, the Pygmy people are a jovial bunch and would prefer to lay around doing very little all day if at all able to. But, due to the need to eat and hunt things and defend themselves against the lizardmans and occasionally go out to eat visiting strangers as well, Brobat's aspect is also necessary. The 2 shamans rule over the village together, or, well, rule is perhaps not the entirely correct term, as they remain technically advisors. But they both wield tremendous influence, and whilst most Pygmies prefer Beesbok for obvious reasons, they would never dare disrespect the gods. And so any Pygmy that ever is in need of advice or help, including chieftains making decisions for the tribe as a whole, will go to consult both shamans. Individually, of course, because the shaman of Brobat and the shaman of Beesbok do not recognize one another, pretending that the other simply does not exist, because if they were ever to recognize that the other was so nearby, there'd probably be violence. This is made all the more macabre by the fact that the shamans are twins. Whenever twins are born in a village, it is celebrated with a great feast and much hubbub, as these 2 have been selected by the gods to become their representatives on Earth. They are then separated and kept aside until they reach the age of 15, when they are appointed through, well, the word of God, to be the official shamans of the village. If there are already shamans, a common enough occurrence as twins aren't that rare, they will simply enter into the service of one of the existing shamans, learning all of his wisdom and special ways. If there are no other shamans ready to raise them in their wisdom and special ways, well, they just kind of assume that the gods will take care of that. There are also special rituals for twin sisters, but they don't become shamans. They eat them. The Pygmies eat a lot of people, okay? This is going to be a reoccurring point. In fact, the Pygmies seem to take tremendous pleasure and general enjoyment in eating things, preferably whilst they're still kicking. This is the reason why they developed a particular toxin that paralyzes a target, but not so much that it outright kills them. It merely makes the victim completely incapable of moving, so that they can be dragged home to the Pygmy village and be tossed in a giant pot. Luckily for the Pygmies, they do not eat exclusively their own kind, as one imagines that adventurers and other humans would begin to reckon this part of the jungle was a very unfortunate place to travel through. And so they also hunt the various creatures of Lustria, things like big cats or monkeys, crocodiles, whatever else they come across. Occasionally also the lizardmen, though more often than not the lizardmen end up hunting the Pygmies, as apparently these once servants of the Old Ones do not have a particularly friendly relationship with these fellow star travelers, seeming to take great offense at their continued presence. Alternatively, it might also be that the Pygmies just keep aggressing upon them. And speaking of aggressing, I am also reminded of the fact that the Amazons live in this same region of Lustria as well. Yeah, I imagine those two groupings also aggress upon one another quite frequently, but we don't actually have a whole lot of knowledge about Amazonian and Pygmy relations, other than that, in a piece of the old Blood Bowl lore, there is a mention that the Amazon team ate a group of Pygmies. So, apparently, in the Pygmies' defense, cannibalism is not something that they alone solely practice. Anyways, Pygmy society is, of course, highly religious, as they assume that whatever happens, happens because of the will of their gods. Be that the desire to punish the Pygmies for some perceived offense, real or otherwise, or to test their mettle, or to grant them various boons and benefits when they've behaved particularly well. Of course, due to the nature of their gods, behaving well often requires them to go out and fight other tribes as well. And despite the average Pygmy's preference for a far more indulgent lifestyle, the Pygmies do appear to wage war upon one another, and whatever's nearby, relatively frequently, as their society seems to be made up quite often of various forms of warriors, like the Pygmy Braves or the Puffs, which are the ones that fire the poisoned dart out of their blowguns. Additionally, we can see on the various artwork that the warrior-looking Pygmies are usually quite nice and fat, at least by the levels of a, 150 centimeter tall pygmy, I suppose. This, too, indicates that they must be fairly high status individuals, suggesting that the Pygmies value warriors greatly, as one must imagine that food is a pretty damn precious resource amongst a group of Pygmies like these, especially considering their favorite god is literally the god of laziness. And thus a big tummy is clearly a status symbol, showing that the warriors are either able to acquire more food for themselves, either by going out hunting, or simply bullying other Pygmies, or hunting other Pygmies, potentially as well, with the chiefs possessing the greatest and the grandest bellies of all. The Pygmies primarily fight using relatively primitive weapons, usually improvised using stones and sticks, with the most advanced form of weaponry they possess being their poisoned darts, which are equipped with a variety of poisons, most of which are of the paralytic kind. They also use large cowhide shields, reminiscent of those used by the Zulus in our real history, and large clubs, presumably both as a status symbol, a rallying symbol, and as a way to bat away enemy shields. They also, very clearly, have a concept of organized warfare, as they possess banners and banner bearers, indicating that when the Pygmies march off to war, they do so in an organized fashion, fighting either in predetermined units or in groups surrounding chieftains or based on villages, or potentially even following their shaman into battle. The shamans too, by the way, do know some spells, although none of them are of the particularly destructive or powerful kind, as more often than not they serve as spiritual advisors to the village, carrying out rituals and beseeching the gods on the villagers' behalf, as well as treating the various ills and ails of the village, like disease or injuries. They are also the ones that produce the toxins used in their blowguns. The warlike nature of the Pygmies is hardly surprising considering their diet and their rather isolated location in the Old World. There are some examples of Pygmies negotiating with and trading with outsiders as well, like some chieftains, for example, learning enough of an outsider's language, usually Norscan, to negotiate with those that come by. Limited trade is likely to happen for weapons, most probably, and in return, probably slaves or jungle resources, although this doesn't happen very often. The Pygmies are not particularly trustworthy, what with them, eating the traders and so on. And the Pygmies themselves don't appear to have any aspirations of civilization. They don't build large cities, which probably would just be torn down by the lizardmans anyways, nor do they seem to strive for any sort of technological evolution, or reinvention considering they were once spacefarers, which is a little bit odd. You'd think they'd be trying to get back to the stars by now, or maybe building a beacon to guide their presumed kin amongst the glittering beyond to their position. But the Pygmies don't seem particularly preoccupied with any of this nonsense, and therefore their interest in foreign goods is probably very, very limited. The Pygmies seem quite content living out in their jungles, worshipping their gods, hunting their prey animals, and venerating their warriors and people of interest and note, with food, bigger bellies, and also a fascination with ritualistic scarification, and the creation of elaborate piercings in ears and noses, often including large bones. Presumably from particularly good meals, maybe? Along with fanciful headdresses and colourful feathers to complete the effect. And that is in all due likelihood where the Pygmies will remain forever, as, I don't expect GW to be bringing these back anytime soon. I really, really, really don't. They were, pushing the envelope a little bit far already when they were created, never mind the modern day. Indeed, I suspect the overwhelming majority of people who work at GW today have no idea the Pygmies ever even existed. Which is a little bit interesting, because when you really come to think about it, the Pygmies are basically a old racial stereotype of Africans, with the added on diminutive part for insult one would expect. But as a Norwegian, and therefore one of the inspirations for the very Norse aesthetic of the dwarfs, I'm starting to feel a little bit personally insulted by the mountain folk as well. Apparently, one racial stereotype is not okay, but the other, mine, is perfectly acceptable. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.